Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we'll be discussing multiculturalism. Joining us on the show is a doctor in Islamic and Christian theology, Dr. ChrisHewer. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
I would like to ask you about multiculturalism. If you can just give us a definition that we would be able to work by so we can look at multiculturalism historically and currently.
We have to begin by saying that there is only one race, and that is the human race. The human race is multi in every respect. It's multilinguistic, it's multicultural, multicolored, multi-historical, and so on. So this humanity is necessarily multicultural. So multicultural means that we live out our common humanity in different ways, in different cultures around the world, and then in some cases those different cultures cross-fertilize and mix together, and so we have a multicultural society. It's as simple as that. It's human beings living like human beings.
But then would you actually consider Britain, for example, to be multicultural?
Britain is a multicultural society. That's a statement of fact, because we have British citizens who come from a whole wide range of different cultures, not just different ethnic groups, people from Africa or from Asia or from Europe, but even within Europeans. We have people who have Spanish culture or Portuguese or Italian or Polish or German, and they're all British citizens. So our very nature is a multicultural nature. There is no such thing as a purebred English person. What does that mean? Because the English nation is over centuries, and it's been infected by different people coming. Different people have settled here: the Vikings, the Danes, the Celts, the Saxons, the Romans, and so on. So we are by definition multicultural.
But then David Cameron, a few years back, he actually stated that Britain isn't really living its multicultural life, in the sense that we're not all integrating and we're not all as communities coming together. Like, yes, there are different people from different countries and different cultures in the UK, in Britain. However, we're not all together, and we're not all, an actual community where you would say this is a multicultural country.
Mm-hmm. I think, first of all, we have to tackle this word integration. Mm-hmm. Integration, in my understanding, means everybody changes. Integration does not mean you become like me or I become like you. This is what we call assimilation, that you must become like me. This is what the French tried. This is at the root of a lot of French problems. Now, integration is something different, and that means that at the end of a process, let's say during the 1960s, 1950s and 60s, lots of people came from the West Indies, from the Indian subcontinent, and they migrated to Britain. Now, at the end of that process of those people accommodating, working within this society, living here, interacting with people, the end result is an integrated society in which everybody has changed. It doesn't mean that the people who came in the 1950s and 60s have now taken on the English culture that existed beforehand. That's multiculturalism. Now, the reality is that we have lots of multiculturalism in different ways. For example, what is the favourite food of the people of Britain? It's curry. This is not some sort of ancient Anglo-Saxon dish. We see people who now will go and eat Chinese food, eat Indian food, they'll go and eat Spanish or Italian food. So on the level of cuisine, people eat each other's food. You get cookery books, people want to take on this culture. We find on the level of music, for example, there's a cross-filtration between one culture and another, so we get a mixing of the cultures on the level of music. Now, this is what we need to promote more, and I would agree then with the Prime Minister's statement that this has not happened enough. For example, if we're going to teach English literature in a multicultural society, we ought deliberately to bring in literature written in English from different cultures around the world. There's lots of wonderful English literature that comes from an African culture, or from an Indian culture, or from an American culture. So they ought to be coming in by right in order to show that they have a part in this multicultural society. When we come to teach geography, for example, do we only teach the geography of Europe? Because there are lots of people, if we're a multicultural society, we need to look at the history of the movement of people and ideas from other cultures around the world. That makes us multicultural. In a multicultural society, I must be educated in order to respect your culture and its contribution to human society. So when we come to teach mathematics or science in schools, are we teaching about the enormous contribution that's made by the transfer of Indian and Persian and Greek knowledge through the Arabic-speaking world into Spain and then back into Europe again? Now then we'd be talking multiculture. So we need to change our perspective here. Multicultural means we have to honour and respect the cultures of all the citizens of our country.
But then to do that, it's quite difficult in the sense that Britain has many, many different cultures here, and and even within the culture itself, there are different traditions and different understandings. So do you think, because there is, for example, in English literature, where students would look at poetry from, for example, Africa and India, but it's not really focused as much as in other subjects as well. So there is that aspect, but then just looking at it as an overall, can it actually be done?
I think we have to slowly work toward it. These things can never be done overnight.
Of course.
I think we're a little bit behind the time. We should have been doing this much more earlier on. And even if my particular culture, I mean, if you take a country like India, for example, now India has 14 nationally approved languages, but thousands of local languages. Now you can't possibly expect to honour and respect all those 14 different, those thousands of different linguistic groups. But the fact that I am struggling to understand that somebody who comes from Kerala and somebody who comes from Assam and somebody who comes from Gujarat have very different cultures and ways of life and background and histories and so on, this is sending out a message, a multicultural message. You cannot possibly cover every shade of cultural difference, but we need to be building this understanding of respect for difference in culture. So when we come to look at history, for example, we're going to teach the history of the British Empire. From whose perspective? From the perspective of the British imperial forces and the way that Britain was made rich and the way that Britain took British culture out to other places around the world? Or are we going to teach that from those who were colonised, for those who were dominated during the British Empire? If you're going to teach the history of slavery, very often in schools they teach the history of slavery. You know, the slavery triangle, and you're going from here to there and taking slaves in the Middle Passage. Well, what about teaching it from the point of view of an African? Teaching it from the point of view of the enslaved people? Teaching it from the point of view of people from the Caribbean islands, for example, where you had whole ethnic groups that were killed and wiped out in order that European colonial plantations could be created there. So multiculturalism means seeing things with many different perspectives.
For example, you did mention the slavery aspect, and that is studied in schools, but we mainly look at it in the sense that historically and how the British wanted to, enslave as many people, and what they actually used to do to them. And then the literature side would be reading books on how people felt when they were enslaved, and the abuse they used to get while being slaves. So that we do kind of get, but as you said, we don't really understand the core of it and what it actually means for the Africans at the time, and even how it's affected them today, because
Correct.
Even though slavery doesn't exist anymore, but still it still exists in the sense of how there's that hierarchy between the two races in a way. It has died down since before, but it's still there, which is, I believe, a problem. But then when we look at the colonialism, don't you think it's still there in the sense that you have many countries that the British did rule at the time, for example, Iraq and India, that still aspire and wish to be like the British Englishmen, for example?
Of course, it is still there. These things are not historical realities, they are contemporary realities. So, for example, I would disagree that we don't have slavery anymore. We do have slavery, but it looks different.
In what way?
We have the slavery of economic control. I get you into debt. You are not a free person anymore. You are enslaved to the debt that I put you into. We have the slavery of global economies. You are not a free person because you are being controlled. If you want the money, you have to grow the crop that we want, even though you can't feed your people. So we have lots of cultural slavery, we have economic slavery. You don't need iron bars to make people slaves. And so one of the things of studying slavery historically is to ask ourselves, if this is part of human nature, what made those people do it? This is part of base human nature. And how is that happening today? So we can see in the same way that we get a globalization of markets, so that you are to make cheap clothes so that we can have cheap clothes to sell in Europe or in America. And in this way, you are demeaning those people, but that's the only way that they can earn their living. Look at the situation of migrant workers around the world. How can it possibly be right that a mother has to leave her children in the Philippines and to go to work as a domestic servant in the Arab lands in order that the people there shouldn't have to do their own domestic work? This is a mother leaving her children, for goodness sake. How can it possibly be right? How can it possibly be right that we have countries around the world who are poor countries, who are investing their poor amount of money in building up their young people and educating them, so that rich countries can go and take them when they graduate and say, wonderful, we've got a doctor, we've got a nurse, didn't cost us anything to train them and educate them, and we will use them to look after our sick people, when there are hundreds of thousands of people from the country from which they come that need their assistance, that need their professional help. This is modern day slavery. You have economic slavery in this way, which robs human beings of their basic fundamental dignity. That's the problem. If you have no means of controlling your working space, so that you say one more word, you lose your job and your family will starve and they'll be thrown out of their house, you're a slave. You may not have iron bars on, but you're a slave. So we need to work and re-establish human dignity. And so part of our multicultural teaching and our multicultural reflection is to see that these things are not just historical, they're going on today as well, in different ways, in different shapes, but these are still problems within human society today that we need to struggle against.
They are actually really big problems. Like, I've never noticed it in that way or looked at it in that way. But then you were saying, for example, that if a manager would be like to an employee, yeah, I will fire you, but then there are legal actions the employee can take against the manager, isn't there? So it wouldn't be much of a problem. But then, as you did mention, like the whole Philippines and going to the Emirates, for example, that is something that does take place a lot in the Arab world.
Sure.
Where, but don't you think it can be stopped in any way, or this type of slavery can be less, let's say?
It can only be lessened when I have that degree of human respect that you are my brother or sister in humanity. Even though I employ you, even though you're brought here to do this menial work, you are a human being of equal dignity to me. I may be a rich multi-millionaire businessman. You are brought in to clean my house, but you have exactly the same human dignity, and you are entitled to exactly the same human respect that I am. And in fact, actually, while you are cleaning my house, you're more important than I am, because I don't want to do that, and I want a clean house. So we have to change these perspectives. Of course, there are going to be people in the world who are richer and poorer than others. There are going to be people of different intellectual levels. There are going to be people whose life is involved in doing manual work, for example. But this must never mean that they are therefore lesser human beings, that their human dignity is in some way belittled because, oh, that's only that menial job. That's a human being. That is my brother or sister in humanity. And only if we adopt that attitude to people can we begin to see that we're going to change the society in which we live.
Our Ahlul Bayt and our Holy Prophets have represented this to us, as Imam Ali alayhi salam does say that if you employ someone to work with you, you would first discuss and set a certain amount where you would pay. At the same time, when they would work, you would pay them even more for what they've done, to make sure that this individual feels respected and feels honoured in what they're doing, and you would keep saying good words to them. But then, like, when listening to that, I felt as if it's just something that, Imam Ali said, and then the majority of managers just put it to the side and said, that's just what Imam Ali does. We're nowhere near him. So with that, like, how can we have that respect with one another if the majority of, managers don't follow that rule?
There have to be ideals, and there has to be a striving for those ideals. If we do not strive for those ideals, then we are accountable. Now, on the Day of Judgment, you are accountable, each one of us is accountable for that which we were able to do. So, if you have the capacity and you have the experience of being a worker in the lowest station within the company, that is your level of accountability. If this other person has the accountability of being a manager and that knowledge, that person has a much greater responsibility and therefore a much greater accountability on the Day of Judgment. So we need to be serious about this and to tell people, if you have been given more is expected from you. This isn't so that you can sit back and enjoy it. So you have a dignity, you have a responsibility toward your employees. There was a famous American industrialist, a Scotsman who migrated to America, called Andrew Carnegie. And Carnegie made a huge amount of money in steel. And he has the saying, which I like very much: the person who dies rich dies disgraced. because you should have used that money for the welfare and benefit of human beings while you were alive. You know, we have the example of the Prophet, for goodness sake. You know, we're told he never goes to bed at night with money in his pocket. If he's been given money during the day for the relief of poor people, he spent it that day. Now, this is the kind of example we need. Carnegie has made a fortune. Carnegie establishes libraries all over the English-speaking world. You go to Ireland, you go to America, you go to all sorts of places. The Carnegie Library is there. He gives that money in order to promote human dignity and worth, not to leave it to his children so they can live a life of idleness and depravity, so that their moral fibre is broken. This is often what happens. You know, one generation makes the money, the next generation squanders it. That cannot be the way of God.
That was actually going to be my next question. When someone doesn't actually strive for the money they've earned and they're just given money, do you think they would actually use it in the correct way and in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or God would actually be pleased with?
They can do, of course. I mean, the simple reality is what we think we earn is really God's gift to us. And so when we are the Khalifa of God, we are the steward responsible. Everything that we get, how much do you pay for the air you breathe? Nothing at all. How much do we pay for the water that we drink? And so on. So everything that we receive is free gift from God. So the human being is not some sort of accountant, some sort of economics professor. The human being knows this is a gift from God, enabling me to actually use the good gifts of God for the people, for humanity, for the welfare of society. So it can never be the case that I say, I'm not going to do as good a job for you as I would do if you were paying me. Human dignity requires that I should serve you to the maximum, 100%, because of your human dignity, because of my human responsibility, whether you're paying me or not. Of course, if you don't pay me, then I can't feed my family. But money is not the motivating factor. And that's where our society goes so badly wrong. Because we're told, oh, well, if you don't pay them enough, they won't be motivated to work. Well, that's a very base motivation. For someone who is the servant of God, then our motivation is for the love of God, for the worship and service of God, for the dignity of another fellow human being. So whether I'm paid a lot or a little for doing the job, I am to serve you for the benefit of your human dignity.
That is true, but then when we look at society in the sense that you do need the money to, pay for your kids, food, to pay for the rent, to pay for their living, let's just put it that way, and then to be working really hard. And even though Imam Ali does say, as an employee, you're meant to be working harder and better than what is actually required of you. But then in today's life, even though, of course, Imam Ali's words are right, but then with the whole expectation of where we're meant to be and how we're meant to, be paying for the rent and food and everything else, isn't it really difficult, let's say? And that's why we do expect to be paid more for our work.
It is, of course, really difficult because none of us can live on fresh air. We all need enough money to be able to discharge our duties and look after our family. You may need a lot more money than I need for doing exactly the same job, because you have more family responsibilities than I have. Let's say you've got 4 children, you've got elderly parents that you need to look after. Your responsibilities, therefore your need for money, is different from mine. I don't have any children, my parents are dead. And so we need, instead of seeing money as the motivating factor, money as the reward which enables you to discharge your human responsibilities. You see, we've come to a crazy situation in the Western world where it is impossible for a parent properly to discharge their responsibilities to their child, because you have to be out at work all the time. Because in order to put a basic roof over your head, not a luxurious house, you need two incomes. Husband and wife need to be out working. And therefore, we deprive you of the ability to actually look after your children in the correct way. Whether it be the husband or the wife, children need their parents. Now, this wasn't written down on some law of stone that all human beings have to follow. This is what human society, in its greed, has done. It has escalated the price of houses in such a way that it requires two salaries in order to even just modestly house a family.
But then how are we going to deal with that? Because most of the situations and the problems that's actually taking place, and it's kind of the cause of divorce, is because the two couple are not able to financially, have enough to actually spend on themselves and on their family, which is causing a lot of problems. So how do you think, of course, because they're not really going to be changing the house prices, but just living the basic life, how do you think we'll be able to manage?
I think it's going to be really difficult, because the reality is very simple. Rich and powerful people are not likely to give up their riches and their power. And the fact of the matter is that the people who have power in their hands are rich people who are benefiting from the society. Now, what it needs, when did you last hear a wealthy person, a banker, or whatever it might be, saying, I insist that the government taxes me more and raises the level of income tax in order that other people should have less money taken from them? Now, this is what's needed, you see. And this requires a complete change in the way that society thinks. Because you may be sure, lots of people who earn very big salaries, they actually think they're worth it. What kind of crazy nonsense is this? They think they're worth it. So we actually need to change that perception. Now, in order to do that, first of all, we have to analyse it. We have to name the problem. And we have to see that this is a problem of human creation. This isn't, part of the natural order or part of a divine law. It's not written in stone and you have to do it. Thirdly, we have to accept that in order to change it, the rich, the powerful, the people with the wealth in their hands will have to lose some of it. We talk a lot about third world, fair trade, all this kind of stuff. This is utter nonsense if we do not accept that the only way that other people in the world who are poor are going to be able to rise out of their poverty is that we who live in the rich Western world will have less. We need to have less in order that they can have more. And we've been talking about this for 40 years. Back in the 1980s, the former Chancellor of Germany, Willy Brandt, headed up the Brandt Commission, the Brandt Report, and what he said very simply was that the global north consumes far too much of the riches of the world for a far too small a proportion of humanity, and the global south just is constantly further impoverishing itself by keeping the rich north richer. The only way that can change is that the rich north must shed some of its wealth to the poor south. Why has nothing happened over 40 years? Because the hand that holds the power wants to keep on holding it.
That is a big problem, especially that there are many events and the comic relief, I believe it's called, and other type of events that they do in order to raise money for, the countries that actually need it. But then when you think about it, it's like, where did all this, money go? If you're really going to be helping them, where is it? Because they reach about millions of pounds, but then you don't know where it's gone, and the country is even worse than it was to begin with. So with that is a really big problem that we do face. But then within Islam, there's the whole aspect of zakat and khumus and sadaqah that we pay. Don't you think that's a way forward for our communities?
These are principles about the circulation of wealth. So zakat, khums, these are anti-hoarding strategies, so that you do not sit on your wealth, but you make it circulate for the benefit of humankind. This is the kind of discussion we need to have. So these are not sadaqah, these are not free will offerings, these are not me giving something out of my generosity. These are the demands of the poor and the charge of the poor on the wealth of the rich. So you calculate your zakat or your khums, and then that money does not belong to you. That belongs to the lawful recipients of that money. So this is the kind of discussion that we need to have. I think there's a lot to contribute here to the wider economic discussion. So we're not asking you, to throw a £5 note in for charity, for comic relief. This is charity. That's in addition. That's fine. What we need to talk about is the circulation of wealth. The poor have rights over the wealth of the rich. That's the principle of zakat and khums. The money must circulate from one to the other by right. So the person who goes to ask for money from the zakat fund is not a beggar. They are claiming their basic right as a human being to be helped from the riches of the rich. This is the discussion we need to have. So we need to think about strategies for transferring wealth by right from the rich to the poor in the world. Of course there needs to be supervision, there needs to be accountability. We need to know that it's been properly used, it's been properly spent, and so on. This is not really our problem. Our problem is that the person who drives around in a £50,000 car doesn't want instead to be driving around perfectly adequately in a £20,000 car. That's the problem. Our own selfish greed, our own, I estimate you according to the car you drive. What utter nonsense. It has 4 wheels, it has an engine and a steering wheel, and I sit in it and you drive me to the station. That's all that matters.
That is true, but then with the whole materialistic aspects that we have in society, what car you drive goes down also not just because of what it would make if you drive a Ferrari instead of driving a Smart, for example. You would seem richer and you would seem better. But then the whole aspect of it is for males mainly, and this is me generalizing, but the better car they have, the better they feel, because a car kind of like identifies them in a way. So that does differ, doesn't it?
It does, and you're getting close to shirk.
In what way?
Well, because you're getting close to saying that actually that image is something that I worship.
Not that I worship.
Well, but it's close, you see. People estimate me according to the car I drive or according to the house that I live in, instead of estimating me according to the criteria of God, which is our basic humanity. So I accept this is what happens in society. You're perfectly right. If somebody arrives at the front door of the office in a chauffeur-driven car, everybody stands to attention. This is an important person. Nonsense. That is the way of the world, but that's not the way of God. On the day of judgment, there are no chauffeur-driven cars to the throne of mercy. Every human being is equal. This is the whole message of the Hajj. This is the message of our lining up in prayer. So the multimillionaire and the poor person are standing side by side before God in prayer. This is the message of Islam. This is the message that all our faith traditions teach us. So I accept that people are judging by false criteria, but this is getting close to shirk. This is getting close to putting other set of values instead of the values of God. And that's shirk, and that's very dangerous.
That is very dangerous. Because like we've had many discussions about with the wealthy, for example, what are they to do with their money? Because they have a lot of money, and because they, worked hard to achieve it, and they are paying their zakat, and they are paying charities, and they are doing, many events for the Ahlul Bayt and for the Prophets, for example. But then they still have a lot of money, and they buy, for example, an extra 2 cars. What do you consider that to be? And as you said it may be shirk before. Just now I'm really interested in what you would analyze this one to be.
We have a teaching. What do you do with wealth which is surplus? You've met all your family needs. You've met all your responsibilities. You have done what is required of you in terms of paying zakat or khums or whatever. What do you then do when you've got surplus wealth? You give it away. You make it work so that other human beings can achieve human dignity. For example, I had a case. I used to work in West Africa and help a development agency there. And there was a project in which in one village there was a group of men who were trained as carpenters. Now, they had the skill. There were people who wanted to buy the furniture, but they couldn't afford to buy the tools and set up a workshop. Now, if you'd given them a loan and you said, you must repay this loan, they would have been forever in poverty. So instead, we approached a wealthy businessman who had more money than he needed. And we said, would you give, it was only a small amount, £5,000, in order to establish a workshop here so that these people can have the dignity of labour, they can look after their families, they can contribute to society because other people want to buy these goods. You will not get any benefit from it. You will not get your name put up in lights. You lose control of that money. God knows you've done it, and God will reward you in the way that God knows best. This is what I understand the Islamic teaching to be. So you don't squander it and say, why don't we replace all the bath taps with gold-plated ones? Instead you say, a bath tap is for turning the water on and off. Let's make that money work well for the benefit of human beings and society. This is Islam.
So it's just giving the money. It's not you getting like at least 1 or 2% from that business, for example.
We're talking about surplus money here. Now, you're doing it without getting any return. So you're not saying, well, I'll give you the 5,000, but I will expect 10% of the profits. No, that's business. This is not business. This is about the circulation of wealth from those who have more than they need to those who are not able to establish basic human dignity. Now, we see this sometimes of people, for example, somebody who owns a lot of land and they don't have a family to leave it to. And so when they die, they divide up their land, and each of the farmers or each of the workers who's working there now has enough land to establish their own independent dignity. Why? Because this land doesn't belong to you at all. You are the custodian of that land. This is Khalifa. You are the custodian. You are the steward. You will be accountable to God for the way that you have used the good things of God. So this idea that I own land, this is a fiction. that land is entrusted to me by God in order to be used according to the ways of God. So if you say to me, well, you own that land, you can pollute it if you want to, you can spread all sorts of toxic chemicals on it if you want to because it's your land, I will say this is totally against the way of God. That land is entrusted to me by God to be used according to the ways of God, and I will be accountable for that. So my intelligence is entrusted to me by God so that I can use it for the benefit of humankind. So what we're trying to do is all the time see the function of religious traditions in society are to hold a mirror up to humanity and say, just look at yourself, look at this now. Do you think that's the way human beings should live? Do you really think that the only way you can judge the worth of a human being is by what they own? By the kind of suits they wear? By the kind of jewellery they wear or the cars that they drive? Nonsense. None of this will make any difference when you lie in your coffin. These are the kind of discussion we need to have. And this is the function of religion in a multicultural, multi-religious society like ours, in which there are lots of people who would say, I'm not religious, I don't believe in God, maybe there is a God, maybe just not part of my world. Okay, that's not my concern, that's God's concern. My concern is your humanity. And this is part of the story that I have for you to reflect on your humanity. How should human life be lived? I'm trying to cross the road and this person comes along in a £50,000 car and says, I want right of way because I've got a £50,000 car. Nonsense.
That is nonsense, and it's a problem that we do face in our communities.
All the time.
But unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.